They say history is written by the victors. But what happens when the victors decide to erase the war entirely? What if the most important war of the modern world never made it to your textbooks, your classrooms, or your screens, not because it wasn't significant, but because acknowledging it would unravel the comfortable narratives we've been taught for over a century? This isn't conspiracy, it's omission. This is the war that changed everything, shaped the borders we live within, laid the foundation for conflicts we still see unfolding today. And yet, no one talks about it. Long before the trenches of Europe filled with soldiers in 1914, a quieter, more cunning war was already underway, not fought in muddy fields, but in royal courts, foreign embassies, desert outposts, and backroom negotiations. The Ottoman Empire, once the dominant force in the Muslim world and a geopolitical titan for centuries, was weakening, economically strained, militarily outdated, and diplomatically isolated. It spanned 3 continents, but its internal cohesion was dissolving. Ethnic group, Serbs, Armenians, Kurds, Greeks began to stir with nationalistic fervor, each believing that the fall of the empire would mean the rise of their own independence. But they were not the only ones watching. Across the waters, Britain and France saw opportunity. For decades, these European empires had been vying for influence across Africa and Asia. But now they had a new prize in mind: the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire and the redistribution of its vast territories. These were lands rich in oil, trade routes, cultural symbolism, and strategic depth. Controlling them meant controlling the future. But to divide an empire, you don't just march in with armies. First, you make promises. Promises you never intend to keep. To the Arabs, Britain whispered seductive words of liberation. If they rose up and helped dismantle the Ottoman regime from within, they would be granted independence, united Arab homeland, free from imperial rule. Sharif Hussein of Mecca believed them, and so did his son Faisal. Together, they orchestrated the Arab Revolt of 1916, inspiring thousands of tribal fighters to join the cause. Under the guidance of British officers like T.E. Lawrence, mortalized later as Lawrence of Arabia, they waged a brutal guerrilla campaign against the Ottomans, sabotaging trains, seizing outposts, and tipping the balance of regional control. But even as they fought in the desert, Britain and France were secretly drafting another plan, a map that would betray every promise made. It was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, signed in 1916, even before the war had ended. It was not a peace treaty, was a blueprint for imperial theft. This secret agreement carved up the Middle East into British and French spheres of influence. Modern-day Syria and Lebanon would fall under French control. Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine would go to the British. And as for the Arabs, the ones who bled and died for their promised homeland. They would receive nothing, no state, no recognition, no voice. It was betrayal on paper, diplomacy with a dagger. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, already gasping for air, was being torn apart from every angle. It had sided with the Central Powers Germany and Austria-Hungary, believing that an alliance with Europe's rising militaries would save its sovereignty. Instead, it marked the beginning of its end. The Gallipoli campaign in 1915 was a rare Ottoman victory, but most battles brought devastation. The empire could not match the industrialized warfare of modern Europe, and as its soldiers fell, so did its infrastructure, its economy, and its morale. But the war's impact wasn't just military. Inside Ottoman lands, old communities fractured. In Anatolia, the Armenian population faced one of the darkest chapters of the early 20th century. In Arab lands, rival tribes were played against each other by foreign agents. In Jerusalem, the seeds of future conflict were planted, watered by European promises and false hope. And all the while, British and French diplomats continued negotiating, carving, shaping, and dividing a world they had no right to own. When the war finally ended in 1918, the Ottomans were defeated and dissolved. What remained of their empire became the modern state of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who rejected imperialism, embraced secular nationalism, and completely rewrote the political future of Anatolia. But the Arab world, it was left in fragments. Britain installed puppet monarchs in Iraq and Jordan. France ruled Syria with a heavy colonial hand. Palestine became a ticking time bomb. These were not sovereign nations. They were mandates, protectorates, chess pieces. And yet, none of this is taught as a singular war. It is fragmented in our education, relegated to footnotes in WWI chapters, broken into case studies, ignored in Western narratives. But the truth is this: this forgotten war was the first truly global struggle for control of the modern Middle East. It set the stage for every conflict that followed. Israel and Palestine, the Gulf Wars, the Syrian Civil War, the rise of authoritarianism, oil politics, sectarian violence, and endless cycles of rebellion and retaliation. It planted the seeds of distrust between East and West. It shaped how empires fall and how new ones rise in their place. Why isn't this war remembered? Because remembering it means facing uncomfortable truths. That borders were drawn not by geography or culture, but by greed. That liberation movements were exploited. That democracy was promised, then denied. That our textbooks aren't wrong by accident, they're incomplete by design. Every modern headline about Middle Eastern unrest, every border dispute, every refugee caravan, every oil negotiation, every military intervention, all of it echoes back to this war. Not the one fought in Europe, but the one fought in silence, in shadows, and then swept aside. So now you know. This war, the one you've never heard of, is the reason your world looks like this. It is the ghost behind modern chaos. The blueprint beneath modern diplomacy. The shadow in every peace deal that never quite brings peace. And here's the part that matters most: this story is not over. Because the lines drawn in that secret agreement still exist. The resentment seeded by those betrayals still burns. The promises broken still echo in every generation that grows up in the ruins of someone else's empire. This is not ancient history. This inherited trauma. This is today, dressed in yesterday's costume. This is why remembrance matters. Because the war we forget is the war we repeat. Now that you've heard it, you can't unhear it. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start noticing the shadows behind the headlines. Because the past isn't past its prologue. Like this video, if you learned something new, share it with someone who still thinks World War I began everything. And subscribe to join us as we uncover the truths history tried to bury here on Visiting the Shadows of the Past.